Why I Became Abstinent. For those of you that know me, this is probably a shocking headline. For those of you that don't, you probably think I'm some sort of a prude or conservative. And while being conservative is not at all a bad thing, I'm not. Let's just start with a brief history. I grew up a relatively sheltered child. The first time a boy told me he liked me, I cried and asked my mom not to tell my dad. My first exposure to the male genitalia was on Omegle when I was in 8th grade at a sleepover, and the first time I had sex, I was 18 and graduated from high school. In my junior year, I, a lonely virgin who actually could drive, somehow became my friend group's go-to for sex advice. I'm talking anal, blowjobs, masturbations, questions about vaginal discharge. Some even confided in me about sexual experiences that today I would classify as sexual assault. My favorite pastime was binge-watching Sexplanation, San Boudram, YouTubers whose niches were relationship and life advice, and embarrassingly enough, Matthew Hussey and other pickup artists. I have no idea what Hussey is up to today, but I can tell you his videos back in 2015 were questionable. You could say I was my high school's Otis Milburn. I prided myself on my extensive knowledge about not only sex, but how to build a good foundation for a relationship, and yet I rarely put those into practice, even after I graduated. To be honest, I can't perfectly recall my first time having sex, but I do remember it was less than romantic. I had been crushing on this person for a while, and he was the quintessential bad boy who did and sold classic party drugs. This entanglement solidified my previous misconceptions about my worth. Through the media I consumed, from songs and movies to books and those YouTube videos, I came to understand that my most valuable asset was my body, and the only way to measure its worth was through my desirability. Make note, I am a cisgender heterosexual woman, but those values transcend gender and sexuality. After that breakup, I began hooking up. My understanding of hookups has drastically changed over the years. Back then, I thought hookups only happened between strangers for one night, so in my eyes, I definitely wasn't doing that. The person I was
no emotions, just sex.
Whatever happens, we stay friends.
Swear.
Swear.
People I'd met from mutual friends or worked with and had hung out with on more than one occasion. In my eyes, I knew these people, and we were friends. Truthfully, I don't remember how many people I'd slept with, but don't act shocked because I'm sure it's less than whatever number you're thinking, and the point isn't how many people I'd slept with, but why. There were quite a few occasions during this period where I had small epiphanies regarding the toxicity of my relationships with my sexuality, but my need for validation often overpowered those small realizations and threw me back into the self-destructive pattern. For me, sex was self-harm. In recent years, some forms of sex have become recognized as NSSI, or non-suicidal self-injury. All sex is not NSSI. The reason I know and acknowledge my past behavior as such is that I used sex as a way to validate myself. It was compulsive. There were times it was unprotected, and I often felt shame about my promiscuity afterward, which caused me to distress. It wasn't until after a more recent relationship that all those ideas became clear. In 2020, I exited an emotionally abusive relationship that was starting to become physical. The person that only value he saw in me was my potential for sex and becoming his housewife. There is nothing wrong with being a housewife. There is something wrong with becoming one because your partner crushed your passions and gaslit you into believing that's all you're good for. This person was a functioning alcoholic, sent suggestive messages to his coworkers, and even told me he slept with one and later denied it. So many shitty things happened during that 11-month relationship. I knew I needed therapy. After a few months of therapy and dissecting those and many other experiences, I made the decision that every girl does at least once after a breakup. I swore off sex. Most of the people I had blocked and even reached out to through both my account and his own, so I obviously wasn't going to reach out to them. Except one. I had been friends with him for a long time and we had been intimate, but he was different. He treated me like a person even when we weren't having sex. Of course, over a year went by since I'd seen him, but I decided to reach out. We hung out twice, and one of those times I broke my rule. I found I still had some things I wasn't confident with. Boundaries. After that, I spoke to my therapist about what happened and how I felt, and I left with a better grasp on the fact that it wasn't the sex that was making me feel gross, it was that I let my boundaries be overstepped. I didn't even communicate those boundaries, so I felt I had no right to be mad at him. Shortly after that experience, I started talking to my now boyfriend. I'll spare you the details, but to sum it up, I felt like I needed to explain to my friend that I was no longer interested in connecting with him on that level, and I was scared. My therapist pointed out that if someone is not okay with a boundary you set for yourself, then they are not a great person to have in your life. So I made that leap and set my boundaries, and surprisingly, the world did not implode. That may seem obvious to some people, but for a lot of women, I know it's a complicated thing. I see videos and posts on social media implying if a girl says she doesn't want to hurt someone's feelings by blocking them or telling them to stop or leave her alone, she doesn't actually want them to leave her alone, and that's not true. Just like me, most women are taught to value themselves based on how other people perceive them. For a good amount of women, being unlikable is a huge fear. Without getting too far down that rabbit hole, it is important to understand that because likability is a trait many young women hold so highly, their interactions with men and women become solely based on tactics they can use to gain approval. How they become liked isn't really that important, but the point is, the goal for a good while is to be liked at any cost. Of course, some young girls and women have a stronger sense of self and understand that it doesn't matter who does or doesn't like them, but again, I am speaking in general terms, and a good portion first learn to value themselves based on the value others place in them. Back to the new relationship. I wanted to continue this new trend of boundary setting, and I told my current boyfriend explicitly that I was not looking for a relationship, but I was open to seeing where this new connection would lead and asked him what he was looking for. I needed to know where his head was. If he just wanted sex, that was absolutely not going to happen, and it would be so much easier to end things there because nothing had started. If he was looking for a relationship, he now knew where I stood. Obviously, we're together and it's been a year, so all is well. At this point, you may be asking how exactly any of this ties into the title. Well, not only have I been in a happy relationship, but I've also been abstinent the whole time. The definition of sex is subjective. What sex is for a heterosexual couple is very different of that from a same-sex couple or other coupling types. Penetration is not the only form of sex. Oral sex is sex. Some people may define any form of hot and heavy touching and kissing as sex, so my boyfriend and I have our own definition. I'm still grappling with emotions and things that bring me back to times where I felt unsafe and unheard, and honestly communicating those feelings to my partner is already difficult for me, and I know I wouldn't be able to work through those things if I were having sex, even with the person I love. People in my position who are inadvertently using sex to cover other feelings or validate worth should try a period of abstinence, but that period must also come with intention. Know why you want to abstain, know what you're hoping to get out of it, be ready to sit with feelings you previously stifled with sex. Understand that it's not going to be easy and at times can be overwhelming. I found I had no idea who I was or what I liked or anything about myself when I decided to be abstinent. As someone who puts so much emphasis on sex and free expression, I had no idea how I was actually using it to harm myself. Now that I'm in a better place and I have a better understanding of my relationship with sex, I feel more confident in my feelings that sexual expression is important and sex needs to be destigmatized through discussion among those having it and in educational settings. Understanding that you can choose to have sex or you can choose to not have sex and both choices are valid is important in protecting people from developing an unhealthy relationship with their sexuality like I did. TLDR. After many years of using sex to numb feelings and gauge my self-worth, I found myself in an abusive relationship that shocked me into therapy, which led me to trying a serious and intentional period of abstinence. This period of abstinence allowed me to take an inward look at myself, which led to difficult realizations and long-term healing. As a person in the psychological field, I see firsthand the benefits of cutting out sex in an effort to better understand oneself, and believe everyone who has had a complicated relationship with sex should try a period of abstinence if they are looking for a long-term way to fill the void they often use sex to fill.